One of the world's greatest mountain ranges, the Coast Mountains of Western British Columbia span an area of approximately 300,000 square kilometers. Our story about the exploration and preservation of the Coast Mountains begins with the native inhabitants of the West Coast. It is clear that many of the more accessible passes and summits were visited regularly by First Nations hunters and gatherers. Ancient trade trails weaved from seashore into the alpine. Necessity bred exploration, not a desire to climb mountains. The earliest exploration of the Coast Mountains by Europeans was sporadic. Trappers and prospectors made forays into unmapped areas throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. It is generally accepted that the birth of mountaineering on the coast was sparked not by climbers in search of peaks, but by North Shore hunters in search of game. Typical of such an ascent was the first recorded ascent of Vancouver's West Lion, known by local natives before settlement as the Two Sisters. At 4 a.m. in July 1889, legendary chief Joe Capilano and two native companions began a hunting foray from a beach encampment on Howe Sound. The party included a paying client, Dr. Henry Bell Irving, who was known to enjoy climbing for climbing's sake. At the end of the day, it was the stubborn pursuit of mountain goats that forced Bell Irving to follow his native guides to the summit of the West Lion, where he claimed the first recorded ascent. The ascent of the West Lion by Bell Irving slowly became known. The North Shore peaks took on a new allure. Hiking up local mountains for the sheer pleasure of experiencing the delights of the alpine became less bohemian. The freedom of the North Shore hills was catching on. Increasing numbers of mountain ramblers trekked up the Grouse Mountain Trail. A new cult of mountain folk slowly formed, and key individuals emerged to shape the future of mountaineering on the coast. By autumn 1906, a small corps of keen mountaineers realized the need for a permanent weather-resistant shelter on the Grouse Plateau. One such enthusiast was Manfred Mills.
In the late summer of 1906, we decided to continue our exploring through the coming fall and winter, also to make a base for hunting the large amount of big game which we had seen during our trips. For these purposes, a cabin was built. This cabin was located in the midst of a fine stand of primeval forest. We named it the Red Shack.
The Red Shack was a focal point for like-minded individuals who came together through similar goals and ambitions. Knowledge of the local mountains was pooled. The Red Shack was a staging area for group outings and social events, including Christmas dinners. For many years, the mysterious peaks north of Vancouver beckoned to ambitious adventurers. One mountain dominated. Its summit was thought to be well over 3,000 meters above sea level. The mountain was known by First Nations as Tsikai, meaning dirty snow. Newer arrivals called it Mount Garibaldi, a name given by a British sea captain in 1860 after an admired Italian patriot, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Several unrecorded attempts to climb Mount Garibaldi in the early 1900s produced little result, barely cresting the tree line. The first recorded attempt came in July 1905, when T. Price, D. Gray, A. King, and A. Dalton failed to reach the summit due to dangerous snow conditions. Two years later, King and Dalton returned to the mountain with 4 others. The group of 6 mountaineers included Atwell King, A.T. Dalton, his son W.T. Dalton, G.B. Warren, T. Pattison, and J.J. Trory. In late July 1907, the climbers departed Vancouver aboard the steamer Britannia, en route for the tiny settlement of Newport, known today as Squamish. From Squamish, a spring wagon carried men and gear for nearly 20 kilometers along the Brackendale-Pemberton Meadows Wagon Road to its junction with the Chekai River. The men continued towards their objective on foot up the Chekai River drainage, and then into inevitable bush and steep wooded slopes. Within 2 days, a high camp was made on Crescent Ridge, known today as Brome Ridge. The days that followed brought showers of rain and wet snow. 2 aborted attempts on the summit were made. Morale was on the decline, and there was talk of giving up. Spurred onward by an adamant will to succeed, Atwell King and A.T. Dalton insisted on an all-out final effort.
In a kind of trance, we at last crawled up a ridge of soft, clean snow and found ourselves standing on a flat, bare rock, with only the four winds about us and the heavens above us. One of our young guides planted a Union Jack, and we realized that a virgin peak was conquered.
King, Dalton and Son, Warren, Pattison and Trory succeeded in climbing Mount Garibaldi. Success on Mount Garibaldi was widely publicized. The event was a catalyst in the psyche of West Coast mountaineers. Mountain climbing was becoming popular enough to warrant the organization of a body to coordinate knowledge of local trails and to give the sport an official status. On October 28, 1907, under the chairmanship of Garibaldi summiteer J.J. Trory, a group of local mountaineers met and organized into the Vancouver Mountaineering Club, which soon enlarged its scope and changed its name to the British Columbia Mountaineering Club. Alongside J.J. Trory, two other Garibaldi summiteers were charter members, W. Dalton and Atwell King, the club's first treasurer. Soon after the inaugural meeting, the membership forged a constitution that has endured for a century. A crest was designed that featured popular peaks near Vancouver. The first elected president of the newly formed organization was J.C. Bishop, affectionately known as Pa. Pa Bishop was a man of smooth integrity who had risen to popularity naturally among North Shore regulars. Bishop's presidency lasted for 3 formative years, until he became the club's first honorary president in 1910. President Bishop was the first to advocate the Mount Garibaldi area as a park reserve for future generations. From its inception, the British Columbia Mountaineering Club engendered a distinct equality between men and women. The first vice presidency was shared by George Edwards and Miss L. Laverock, a competent mountaineer in her own right. Perhaps even more than men, women found a rightful place among local mountains. They thrived on the new freedoms found within their beauty and adventure. Women expertly carried out leadership roles throughout the history of the club. The social framework of the new club created a medium for keen individuals to rise and shine. Manfred, or Fred, Mills was a well-known North Shore regular. He'd been involved with the building of the Red Shack and was a charter member of the club. Over many years, he received great acclaim as a route finder, especially from those newly baptized by Coast Mountain Bush. It seemed only logical that Fred Mills should be the BCMC's first director of excursions. No easy task, it rested upon the trip director to coordinate and, when necessary, lead large groups of mountaineers safely to and from their mountain objectives. In 1908, Mills' reputation as a climber of the highest standards became indisputable when he led the groundbreaking first ascent of the Camel, a block of vertical rock adjacent to the summit of Crown Mountain. The daunting feature was considered to be the most hazardous and technically difficult unclimbed peak near Vancouver. In 1910 to 1912 were vital years within the BCMC. The summer of 1910 brought the first British Columbia Mountaineering Club summer camp, held at Round Mountain, near today's Heather Meadows, south of Mount Garibaldi. By now, the club had outgrown the minimalist Red Shack. In the spring of 1910, land was acquired on Grouse Mountain, and a new cabin was constructed by club members over just 7 weekends. A grand opening celebration took place in February 1911. Dinner was served, and a melodrama was enacted that gave as much fun to the actors as to the audience. In 1912, one of Fred Mill's ardent young protégés was elected club president. Billy Gray was a shooting star. A charter member of the club, Billy Gray was diplomatic and energetic. He participated in many club first ascents. His contribution to the growth of local mountaineering was significant. Over several seasons of steady refinement, the clubhouse became a comfortable and attractive gathering place. Its walls echoed with tales of ambition, and, perhaps more importantly, song and laughter. From the onset of coast mountaineering, a significant challenge was the serious void in accurate maps. President Billy Gray embarked on an extensive photographic and plane table survey work to produce the first Garibaldi area maps. In 1912, almost single-handedly, Gray blazed the first access trail from the Cheakamus Valley to Black Tusk Meadows, where the third club camp was held that year. The BC Mountaineering Club was thriving. Members took great pride in their unprejudiced and democratic ways, chiming with satisfaction that climbing partners came from all walks of life and levels of income, all gentlemen and gentlewomen. The first annual BCMC publication arose from a vast accumulation of exploratory and scientific knowledge collected by the club. Entitled The Northern Cordilleran, the thickly bound journal contained as much information about living things and the need for conservation as it did about mountains and mountain climbing. World War I brought a noticeable decline of men within the club, since many of them enlisted. Women members kept the BCMC alive by embracing administrative duties and organizing weekly club outings. Miss E.B. Fowler was elected as the first woman trip director, having charge of the organization and guidance of mountain trips. The post-war period brought revitalization and momentum. Exploration of the local mountains continued with renewed zest. Throughout the 1920s, activities continued with increasing numbers and success. This was due mainly to trip director Tom Files. Tom Files was described as a mild-mannered climber. Files' first ascents number in the dozens. Solo first ascents included the north peak of Black Tusk, the Table, and, after 3 attempts over several years, the southwest peak of the remote Judge Howe. Eventually, club activities became so numerous that a committee replaced trip director duties. As the BCMC's longest-serving trip director, Tom Files inducted many young men and women into the challenges and rewards of the mountains. Neil Carter was just such an inductee. Carter joined the BCMC in 1920 at the age of 17. Within 4 years, he accomplished the first ascents of Wedge Mountain, Mount Turner, and Diavolo. But Carter's allegiance was always to the coast mountains of BC, where he undertook many ambitious projects, including an early expedition to the Lillooet Icefield, and later a valiant attempt on Mount Waddington, where his friend Alec Dalgleish was killed. Carter matched his prolific mountaineering with a penchant for cartography. He refined Billy Gray's original map of the Garibaldi area and undertook mapping of the Tantalus Range. The 1920s continued significant effort by the BCMC to preserve the invaluable environs of Mount Garibaldi. For nearly 2 decades, the club held annual summer camps in the Black Tusk and Mount Garibaldi meadows, and assisted other groups, such as the Mazamas and the Seattle Mountaineers, to hold camps there. The strategy was to draw public attention towards protecting the entire area as a park. In 1926, a club camp of 83 people, to which the public was invited, rallied supporters to the Garibaldi cause, and the Garibaldi Park Act was legislated on March 7, 1927. The unflagging efforts of BCMC members had helped secure one of the most beautiful parks in the world. During the early 1930s, two club members gained notoriety within the mountaineering community. They clearly demonstrated an intense and complete dedication to their mountain way of life, and to each other. Phyllis and Don Munday can hardly be denied a rightful place as the best-known couple in the history of coast mountain exploration. Don had joined the BCMC in 1910. Shortly after immigrating with her family from Ceylon to Canada, Phyllis James spent several years in the mountains of the West Kootenays before moving to Vancouver. Don Munday met Phyllis James in 1918.
Then finally I met Don, and he was a climber, and I belonged to the BC Mountaineering Club at that time. We met quite often, of course, on their trips. Well, I was always keen on the out of doors, and you were never seen on the street with breeches in those days, so we'd wear a skirt over our breeches. And then when we got to the foot of the mountain or foot of the trail, wherever you happened to be, you took your skirt off.
In 1923, Don began a commitment to the BCMC as the first editor of a new monthly newsletter entitled The BC Mountaineer. By 1925, mountaineering in the Coast Mountains had been contained within a 100-mile radius of the city of Vancouver. Very little was known about the vast area of coastal peaks further north. During a pleasant lunch atop Vancouver Island's Mount Arrowsmith, a torch was lit by the sight of a distant giant. In Don's words, "The Monday's persistence of vision stayed clear. For nearly a decade, with the help of a small support group, the undaunted couple left daughter Edith with relatives or friends and obsessively attempted the peak known today as Mount Waddington, the highest mountain entirely within British Columbia and the only one over 4,000 meters high."
Well, we just went, first of all, in our rowboat up Night Inlet and cached the boat in the bush, and then Don built a gas boat in the basement, took the wall of the house out.
In 1928, on their third attempt, they succeeded by full moonlight in reaching the slightly lower northwest summit at dawn. They would reach this summit twice over the next 2 years, but the main summit continued to disallow their presence. Their persistent and heroic exploits are recorded in Don's book, Mystery Mountain. 1934 marked the end of the Monday's attempts on Mount Waddington. Finally, in 1936, Fritz Wiesner and Bill House forged a way to the main summit. Throughout the mid-30s, the golden age of coast mountain exploration on foot and on horseback was being slowly but surely supplemented by those willing to apply the benefits of the train and the combustion engine in its various manifestations. This rare archival footage from 1933 provides stirring evidence of a new revolution in coast mountain approaches. Near Vancouver, Garibaldi Lake was among the first to feel pontoons slice through her azure waters. A once multi-day objective was turned into a one-day outing. During the 1940s, the Mountain Emergency Squad organized to assist the RCMP and the BC Forest Service in general search and rescue. The operation attracted many BCMC members. In the 50s, the squad evolved into the Mountain Rescue Group, the predecessor of North Shore Search and Rescue. The British Columbia Mountaineering Club offered opportunities for mountain experiences further afield. Annual club excursions to the Rockies began as early as the 1920s. Throughout the decades, regular BCMC trips to the Rocky Mountains became routine. The 1950s and 60s ushered in a huge European influence to the Coast Mountains. Techniques and technology honed in France, Germany, New Zealand, and Switzerland brought new standards. New routes were accomplished up popular peaks as European focus envisioned lines of greater technical difficulty. The influx of European mountaineers brought a new wave of vitality to the Coast Mountains. These climbers harbored a deep love of mountains and relished the untracked wilds of their new home, the Coast Mountains. Two climbers who played a central role in the Coast Mountains during the 1960s were Esther and Martin Kafer. The Kafers arrived from Switzerland in 1958. The notion of unexplored mountains blossomed into a life of mutual wonder and adventure. They were two of the finest mountaineers in the Vancouver climbing community and showed their love and support of the sport by a lifetime involvement within the BC Mountaineering Club.
In the 60s and 70s, when we did our exploratory climbing, it was harder to get into the mountains. Therefore, the club organized these things. So sometimes we had 12 people, up to 16. But we never climbed together. We always went into little groups, which formed quite naturally.
What I also found about the BC Mountaineering Club was, in essence, it did more to encourage the women to be part of the club.
In Switzerland, the Alpine Club consisting only of men, and they did not allow women climbers. When I came to Canada, I found there was no difference, male or female, and very, very often I was climbing with just men alone, or on occasions I was the leader for about 12 men.
Another benevolent spirit in the Coast Mountains was a talented mountaineer and artist named Paul Binkert. Born just meters from the Swiss border in Germany, Binkert joined a wave of European-trained alpinists and, after honing his skills on South American volcanoes, found an irresistible freedom to roam at will in the coastal hills. Quietly determined, he was a member of the British Columbia Centennial climb of Mount Fairweather in 1958. He is best remembered by his longtime friend Martin Kafer for his untiring work on local trails near his home city of Vancouver.
He was probably involved in 20 or 30 different trail building projects. The most well-known trail is the Binkert Trail that goes up from Harvey Creek to the Lions.
As air approaches became the norm in the Coast Mountains, the remoteness of distant objectives seemed to diminish simply by the lessening of the time commitment required to reach them. The eyes and ears of coast mountaineers perked up. One such mountaineer was Roy Mason. In 1957, as part of the BCMC's 50th anniversary celebration, Roy took part in the first ascent of Anniversary Peak, later renamed Mount Mathieu. The area was quite remote. But as with a growing list of Coast Mountain first ascents, the team's approach advantage was an airplane on floats. After experiencing several air-supported expeditions, Roy's spirit glowed with the possibilities. Eventually, he became the best-known mountaineering pilot in the history of the Coast Mountains. Many early flying adventures are recounted in his book, Ice Runway.
I wandered all around the Lillooet-Harrison area and was curious, looking for lakes, really. On floats, I was always on the hunt for small alpine lakes and wandered into the top of the Stein with that in mind. And I guess that's where I first saw the very beautiful lakes at the head of the Stein Valley. Well, I was really taken by the three lakes, which are really the sort of jewels in the crown of the Stein. Tundra Lake with its very, very deep blue color, and Clackaporn Lake, which is royal blue, and at a lower altitude, Stein Lake, which is more of a typical glacier-fed green lake. It was the colors that attracted me. My original thought was to try and establish a small reserve or park. I prepared a brief saying why I thought it was unique enough to be preserved, and I submitted that to the Premier of the province and various cabinet ministers. The result was very surprising. It was a matter of days, maybe a week, 2 weeks at the most, and a moratorium was established over the whole area, and nobody was more surprised than I was.
Due to vandalism and easier access by road or by ski lift, the BCMC cabins on Grouse Mountain and Mount Seymour steadily fell into disuse. In the late 60s, BCMC membership approved the sale of these assets, with the strategy of using the proceeds to build huts in suitable, more remote mountaineering areas. A unique Gothic arch construction designed by BCMC member Hugh Batzer was the design of choice. The term Batzer hut was adopted, and soon efforts were made to place these shelters in strategic locales throughout the coast mountains. Two huts, the Wedgemount and Russet Lake huts, were built with financial assistance from the Provincial Parks Department and then donated to Garibaldi Park. Most noteworthy of the BCMC huts is the Plummer Hut, which was built on Claw Ridge in the Mount Waddington area. The Plummer Hut is named after Paul Plummer, a BCMC member and mountaineer who tragically perished with his family aboard their private plane. As the 60s gave way to the 70s, one climber surfaced as an unstoppable force in the coast mountains. Described by a close friend as being a very unusual young man, Dick Culbert is best known for uncanny route-finding skills and an almost superhuman ability to steadily climb up the most rotten rock imaginable. With Herculean ambition and the energy of youth, Dick Culbert imbued self-reliance. His education and profession as a geologist provided a diverse academic knowledge that few possessed within the mountainous lands he thrust himself into. Long, remote alpine traverses gave way to serious technical routes up difficult peaks.
When I was 19, my first big trip was almost a month alone, exploring up in the North Country. And then gradually, as things got more explored, got into doing more difficult routes in the mountains. The coast mountains, especially in the early days, were certainly a place where you had to put in a lot of physical labor just to get to the mountains. We used to characterize the coast mountains as the 5 ugly B's: bush, bears, bugs, big rivers, and bad weather. And they're all part of mountaineering, and still, it's a worthwhile sport. The Alpine Guide Southwest BC was just a local modernification of the 2 original guides. And a lot of it was done riding freight, hitchhiking. Glenn Woodsworth had a large part in some of these. Glenn Woodsworth was my climbing partner through many expeditions, especially in the early days of climbing and exploring in the coast mountains and compiling the guidebook. He was just a wonderful person to be with. He saw me through a lot of extremely dangerous situations and a lot of long, difficult expeditions. And I can't say enough good about him, really.
The climbing world has certainly changed in the last 40, 50 years. And certainly all the stuff to do with gear has changed. But I think that for me, the most significant changes which I've seen has been maps. When I started, there was nothing good in the way of maps for the coast mountains. And some of them didn't even show any of the peaks properly, or they had the peaks in the wrong place, and they missed valleys and all sorts of stuff. And now, of course, we've got first-rate maps, even better maps online. But the other thing about to do with the maps is now people have GPSs. You can download the map, the GPS, and carry it around, and it'll plot exactly where you are on the map. So I think we're living in perhaps the last couple of decades where people are going to be able to navigate in the mountains safely with map and compass. I think much of mountaineering is ultimately a selfish activity. We do this, we keep lists of our ascents, our first ascents, our fast times, things like that. And there's really nothing in it for society. And I think where the societal good comes is through organizations like the BCMC, the Alpine Club, and so forth. Because they can help educate the broader public about the need to preserve some of these spaces. The clubs are very good in conservation. I think it's important that all climbers really spend at least part of their time being actively involved with one club or another.
John Clark was a man of wonderful enthusiasm and zest. He joined the BCMC at the tender age of 17 and was heavily influenced by numerous afternoon teas with an aging Phyllis Munday. His earliest extended trip into the mountains was on the first exploratory ski expedition organized by the BCMC, led by Esther Kafer.
After about 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that, something happens. And you get into that phase where you do get a sense of the landscape in a primeval kind of a way. It's almost as if you've unlearned everything that you knew about your city existence, and you've sort of stepped into another reality.
Accomplishing at least 800 first ascents of coast mountain peaks and bumps, John continued a spring and summer schedule of extended forays without serious mishap, until one fateful day during a 1994 ski traverse, he witnessed one of his gentle companions swept to his death by a small avalanche. The untimely death of Randy Stoltman prompted a sea change in John. He put aside his eccentric travels for a mission bent on educating schoolchildren about the fragility of our beautiful Earth. Without delay, he gathered his traveling slideshow and with Lisa Bale founded the Wilderness Education Program, now known as Wild Ed. In 2007, 100 years after the first ascent of Mount Garibaldi, a group of British Columbia Mountaineering Club members returned J.J. Trory's ice axe to the summit. Dressed in period clothing for the event, the climbers celebrated a century of British Columbia Mountaineering Club heritage. In the end, there are as many reasons why people climb as there are climbers. The stewardship of the coast mountains is our collective responsibility. We owe the mountains our gratitude. Beyond the jagged horizon, unknown adventures and rewards await those who share a passion for the mountains.